It's an alarming concept, the idea of a god falling to despair. I remember as a kid walking in on one of my parents crying and being unable to accept it. At that age, adults functionally seemed like deities, and how could any weight, any tragedy, break an almighty being? Yet divine tears have always flowed through storytelling in insufficient quantities to drown mortals. There are tragedies that shatter gods, and the pieces fall upon creation. If a despairing god looks upon their world and finds it meaningless, what becomes of creation? Hayao Miyazaki's The Boy and the Heron is set in a land flooded with melancholy, soaked in the grief of its disheartened deity. Like the Arthurian kingdom of the Fisher King, this world quakes upon the arthritic shoulders of its ailing monarch, a godlike being whose injuries and sorrows manifest physically in the realm and its inhabitants. Though an almighty sorcerer, the ruler of the film must perpetually balance a tower of blocks to keep his creation from crumbling, and convinced that his works no longer hold value, he is sunken into despair. A despair that could topple everything he's built. It's impossible to understand Miyazaki's grieving god without understanding Miyazaki's personal struggles as a creator. Though to many his capacity for building worlds borders on the divine, like the sorcerer, Miyazaki is exceptionally pessimistic regarding the legacy of his creations. Indeed, on a metafictional level, the true Fisher King of The Boy and the Heron, whose sadness shapes the very land, isn't any of the characters, but Miyazaki himself. After all, for the inhabitants of a work, what is the despair of the author if not the despair of God, as sorrows flow from their almighty pen to all corners of an invented reality? When the creator weeps, everyone feels the rain. What do we think of when we think of a god's tears? In fiction, when a higher power rains misery upon their subjects, they often do very literally rain misery. Rain in storytelling feels like a command from on high that it's time for despair. When there's a breakup or a funeral, you can guess the forecast. Rain as a signal of divine depression is rarely more literal than in the highly underrated Sirocco in the Kingdom of Winds, a French animated film set in a land where mortals live in fear of the mood swings of a melancholy storm god. Sirocco seems, at first, to mirror numerous temperamental weather deities in traditional mythology, his very name coming from a wind current associated with the Greek god Notus, who was famed for his gloominess. But like the sorcerer of The Boy and the Heron, Sirocco is not the true author of his land's melancholy. Within the film's framework, he and his kingdom are ultimately but the dream of a human novelist, a world created as a way of processing the grief she felt after the death of her sister. Though the despondent Sirocco may be the god of reality as he understands it, it is not truly his despair that causes the rain to fall. When he weeps, he is crying another's tears. The question, who is the true author of one's tears, is a bit like asking, who is the true author of the rain? The answer depends on your metaphysical outlook. In the 17th century treatise The Anatomy of Melancholy, one of the earliest tomes on the origin of despair, author Robert Burton claimed feelings of depression typically come straight from God, as was the standard belief of the era. But notably, Burton was also an early proponent of how weather itself might influence gloom, speculating, long before our notions of seasonal depression, if too many overcast days could dampen a spirit. Climatological patterns, he theorized, could act as celestial deities of misery all on their own, and not just the rain, but also the rogue waves have traditionally inspired moodier gods than the rain. Though links between rainfall and despairing gods certainly exist in numerous mythologies, a downpour could also bring soothing relief, irrigate crops. It wasn't only a reason for tears, but to behold a true tidal wave, even today, is to feel that you're in the presence of the most volatile deity. The animated film Children of the Sea instills a similar feeling, for while the story features some literal and classically temperamental sea deities, The sea itself, with its waves, its surges, its unknowable depths, feels more like a temperamental god than they do. You get a sense of the ocean's body throughout this film, the colossal pulse of its heart, the rise and fall of its lungs. There's a rhythm to this deity, vast and cosmic as the most distant nebula. It breathes. Sometimes it weeps. It is blindingly self-evident why functionally every human culture has at least one tempestuous god of the waters. There's around 1.4 quintillion tons of the stuff on our planet's surface, and it is always moving, always changing form, or threatening to blast our fragile vessels back to the abyss. Psychologist Carl Jung theorized our most dour deities emerged in the first place to explain such unpredictable processes of nature, turning random patterns like the tides into emotive allegories of divine feeling. When the gods are calm, the sea is gentle. When they're angry, it churns. When they despair, the world ends. One of the most universal narratives that thunders throughout history is that of the Great Deluge, a flood brought on by a higher force becoming despondent over the state of the world and deciding to wipe it away. In his book Parallel Myths, author J.F. Bierlein notes that while Norse mythology does not end in a flood of water, it does end in a flood of ice, a mighty winter or Fimbulwinter of frigid melancholy that entombs the earth before the raging fires of Ragnarok end the world for good. In the game God of War Ragnarok, the link between divine depression and doomsday is about as explicit as it gets. Like its 2018 predecessor, Ragnarok tells the story of the bereaved war god Kratos quietly despairing over the death of his wife and the sins of his past, while the end of the Norse world marches ever closer. And Kratos may well play a part in that end. A displaced deity from Greece, Kratos' temperament has already drowned one pantheon. But while Kratos' emotions were once a tidal force literally flooding the world, now they're glacial, locked in ice like the rest of Midgard and Fimbulwinter, only cracking under apocalyptic pressure. But Kratos isn't the only god with some fittingly seasonal depression. The character of Thor is very overtly Kratos' parallel, also grieving dead family members and the monstrous choices of his past. But while Kratos is determined to prove he's changed, Thor is determined to prove he hasn't, that he's still only got fury in his heart with no occupancy for sadness. He welcomes the infernal rage of Ragnarok. It's better than cold despair. Throughout fiction, a god struggling with depression is often treated as a joke, but Thor's misery in God of War isn't comedic. He's a recovering alcoholic, but not in a silly ha-ha way. His decline is tearing his family apart with grim realism, no Armageddon required. Even with the apocalypse on the horizon, grief is the most powerful force in God of War Ragnarok, and ultimately, the most destructive. When discussing the Kratos floods, there are over 1,000 ways of translating the Old Testament passage Genesis 6:6, where the Almighty decides to flood the world. It grieved him to his heart, it grieved him in his heart, he was grieved in his heart. But if there's a consistent thread through it all, it's grief. Though often characterized as an act of rage, most translations say anger didn't unleash the waters, grief did. Despair and the biblical end of days are the two thematic rivers that flow intertwined through the exceptionally depressing and ludicrously titled Devilman Crybaby, a show whose madcap visual style does not properly prepare you for the depths of its central tragedy. To keep things spoiler light, though spoiler free is impossible, Devilman tells the story of a Lucifer who feels ripped right from Milton's Paradise Lost, a tempestuous fallen angel desperate to be avenged upon his creator by taking a turn at erasing humanity. Yet Devilman is as visually preoccupied with personal tragedies, with literal crying, as it is apocalyptic imagery, giving a fallen tear and a falling planet equal weight. This is intensely fitting for the ultimate arc of the story, where, without getting into specifics, the loss of a single person proves as cataclysmically crushing as the loss of continents. Though realized too late, there is nothing left after a flood. A canvas wiped clean holds only regret. Where do you begin after everything is erased by divine anguish? In the game The Unfinished Swan, my first instinct was to throw paint around. With each new globule, I started to get my bearings. I was in a featureless void, sure, but there was context. The splatters revealed unseen walls. Was I in a room? It seemed like it, but rounding a corner, I stumbled blindly into a greater vacuum, and was that a park bench? Wait, was I outside? How big was this place? The world of The Unfinished Swan, as you come to discover, is the remnants of a vast kingdom created by a godlike monarch whose works were washed away into blankness as he fell into a long depression. The game is very textually a piece about how despair effaces a creative work. The character you play as, Monroe, is the son of a painter who started over 300 portraits, but due to their declining mental health, never finished a single one. In this regard, The Unfinished Swan's narrative and gameplay are perfect complements as you rediscover a fragmentary canvas of lost creation in a flood of ink. There is a second metatextual layer at play here in the way the despairing monarch who created and then lost this world is voiced by director Terry Gilliam, an artist known for wildly ambitious works that tackle themes of theology and despondency, but who also famously struggles to complete films on time and on budget, as both the scope and his on-set behavior delays production for years. I'm reminded of how production of Children of the Sea pushed the studio that made it near the breaking point, and just looking at the visuals, I can absolutely believe it. For an artist, the cost of trying to portray a despairing god may be one of personal despair. Eventually, there is nothing left. Eventually, the ocean dries up. It's remarkable how far different artists have gone throughout history to capture the despair of creation. One of the oldest blue pigments, ultramarine, has a name that comes from the Latin ultramarinus, meaning beyond the sea, because that's how far the materials had to come from to make it onto a canvas. And yet creatives sought out this color over and over for famous and vibrant paintings, but also for bleak ones. Some of the most heart-rending seascapes were made possible with a splash of the hue from beyond the sea. I cannot help but feel emotional about the human need to seek out tonalities of blue, to speak to the melancholy of the world around them. When we think famous depressive art, our first instinct might be visions of people weeping, faces frowning, but with a divine artistic eye that is suitably despondent, a landscape can frown too. Creation can weep. It's one thing to pathologize a painted landscape as depressed, for that may well have been the artist's intention. But it's another thing to pathologize natural landscapes as depressed, to imagine gloomy scenery as the product of divine melancholy. This impulse to assign authorial intent to somber terrain is placed under a uniquely telescopic lens in the Icelandic film Godland. The story of a 19th century Danish missionary seeking to establish a church within a remote region of Iceland, Godland is shot on 35mm film, the narrow weathered frame causing the viewer to constantly think about the borders of the scene, much like one would consider a grim painting. This is how the missionary himself characterizes the formidable landscape that surrounds him, a region he finds so bleak he thinks it must be the will, if not the punishment, of a higher power. In his book, The Empire of Depression, author Jonathan Sadowski relays how in the 3rd century, a missionary living in Alexandria characterized despair as the product of the demon acedia, a creature who attacks a monk's soul between the 4th and 8th hours and makes the sun appear sluggish and immobile, as if the day had 50 hours. One must wonder what said priest would make of Iceland, which experiences nearly 24 hours of sunlight in summer and as little as 4 hours in winter. But as the missionary in Godland's sanity declines further and further, the film presents us with an alternate framing of the so-called unholy terrain. To the local inhabitants, the land is simply land. The wilderness not some divine penalty or woeful portrait, but merely the way things are. Despair is in the eye of the beholder. Godland pays particular attention to small moments, the minor processes of life and death, and all the subtle beauties found therein. If this land was painted, it needn't have been by a despairing artist. When a creator paints the world in blue and black, it's perhaps human instinct to make assumptions about their mental state. We have this image of the great artist bordering on deific, who is tortured by their own powers of creativity. We expect, almost demand, transcendently talented figures to be depressed, especially if their work is melancholy. The blue period, the black paintings, any of the works discussed so far? An artistic mind with sufficient depths to contain worlds is supposed to be one that's easy to drown in. This is a philosophy that the lead character in the Russian film Hard to Be a God desperately clings to. Set on a planet trapped in an age of disease and squalor analogous to bubonic plague-era Europe, the narrative follows the actions of the off-world operative Rumata, a man supposedly assigned to help better the local society, but who is instead resculpting its cruelties for his benefit. Rumata is pretending to be a literal deity, and while the violence required to maintain the facade has left him miserable and lonely, he nonetheless seems to find strange value in his own anguished machinations. While Rumata of course knows he isn't a god, he does seem to view himself as a kind of divine artist, a tortured yet brilliant creative resculpting the world in a way that only he can. Rumata cannot accept, he cannot entertain the possibility that one could be an artist without losing their soul to despair, that one could play at God without sacrificing their humanity.
Что Богом быть трудно.
Is it an inherent truth that to bear the burden of creator, to be the dreamer that holds the grand dream together, is to suffer? The episode of The Twilight Zone Shadowplay explores the psyche of a man who claims that the entire world is simply his dream, and that if he dies, everything will stop existing. His claims are of course not taken seriously. The man is a convicted murderer on death row. He obviously isn't mentally stable and is surely just trying to weasel out of his fate. It is a disturbing thought, though, that creation is powered by a single miserable mind, used like a battery while kept in a state of constant torment, and troubled by the man's insistence, other characters start noticing little droughts in the logic of existence. Yet surely this is just paranoia. Reality is real, and you would know if you were in a dream, if you were in someone else's dream. Life must be more than the delusion of a miserable god. So in the end, they go ahead with the execution, and in the end, there is nothing left but... Say a creation is but the dream of a despairing deity. Is it better to keep said deity dreaming, even in a state of despair, so that the rest of us can continue to enjoy their vision? In the game Signalis, major spoilers ahead, it is possible that everything past the title screen is the reality-warping dream of a miserable god. A god who is ready to shut their eyes for good. But Signalis is not so simple as to have a single layer of dream logic. The game centers on androids called replicas, copies of human memories imperfectly downloaded into mechanical bodies, their artificial minds suffering breakdowns and hallucinations. And the grief and trauma of the characters isn't just warping the in-game reality, it's warping the game itself. Signalis is unafraid to confront you with bold surges of imagery or flashes of distorted text. One of the most persistent intercuts is a memory of a painting, which is, in real life, called Isle of the Dead by Swiss artist Arnold Böcklin. Böcklin made multiple versions of this painting throughout his life, copies of copies like the in-game replicas, memories of memories. A central landscape of the boy and the heron's collapsing world is also inspired by Isle of the Dead, and the Word of God, or Miyazaki, confirms this is an intentional replica. The painting itself depicts a figure in white being rowed by an oarsman towards a mysterious isle, a scene that resembles the minor Greek deity of Heron ferrying the dead across the river Styx. There are obvious ways such a work might connect to themes of sorrow, loss, and the divine present in the text of both Signalis and The Boy and the Heron, but like the creators behind both the aforementioned works, it's worth noting Böcklin refused to explain his creation publicly, simply calling it a dream. Likewise, while Signalis is a tangled knot of tragedy and religious imagery, one you could spend hours trying to definitively untangle, by design, not all the details of Signalis' world entirely hang together. It is the mental image of a weeping god. Inevitably, things get a little blurry. Taken on its most literal level, the world of Signalis seems pretty hopeless. So does the world of The Boy and the Heron, or hell, almost any setting mentioned in this video, but I personally find Signalis and other divine tearjerker narratives deeply cathartic. These tragedies make each small act of kindness all the more sincere, each moment of beauty all the more poignant. The very word sadness originally meant fullness, coming from the Latin satis that also gave us satisfaction. For a creator's piece of art to instill sadness at all is its own emotional miracle, proof that a work resonated with those who gazed upon it. Signalis frankly fills me with hope about the capacity of a creative work to be emotionally fulfilling, especially since it was created by a development team of 2 people and was a massive success. Forget the trope of the despairing artist, Signalis is a triumph that deserves to be deified. But that's a little too clean a conclusion, isn't it? Because creating something can involve despair. I don't believe it has to. In fact, I think it's dangerous to believe it has to, but that doesn't change the fact that it often does. And while I'm not at the level of the creators in this video, I'm not entirely sure my own smaller creative process is always healthy, and I'm sure a lot of people who create stuff can probably relate. I think one can get lost in the seas of one's own creation. Those miserable depths have a certain allure. But there's nothing down there that's worth drowning for. Take a breath. Come up for air. Whew. Alright. You know, I obviously didn't think a video on broken gods would be cheery, but parts of this research process were so gloomy, it got me thinking, are the gods ever, happy? I mean, think about it. Divine power seems like a pretty sweet gig, so why is it that across fiction and mythology, we seem to rarely catch deities in a good mood? Investigating this mystery led to the creation of an entire second video that you can watch right now, only on Nebula. Nebula is like if someone with a human soul made a streaming platform. A radical concept, I know. It is ad-free, creator-owned, and indeed, were it not for support from my Nebula followers, I would not be able to release videos here on YouTube as often as I do. And you can support me too by signing up for Nebula and receiving exclusive Curious Archive videos and access to all my videos at least 24 hours early, and there's like a whole other library of incredible stuff stapled to this deal. You remember when iceberg videos were everywhere on YouTube? Well, the Nebula iceberg is just insane. Tierzu has this Let's Play channel I'd never heard of. There's a 9-part documentary from Real Engineering on the logistics of D-Day. Riff Tracks, the guys who did MST3K, are somehow on there too, uploading new full movie commentaries each week. And all this is only $3 a month with an annual subscription. If you sign up using my link on screen or in the description to get 40% off. And once you've finished listening to me talk about what happens after a god is pleased, and spoiler alert, as it turns out, a happy god is not always a good thing for mortals. There are literally years of stuff on Nebula for you to catch up on. We just launched a new show, Abolish Everything, and it's real funny. They don't even pay me to say that, it's just true. And if you want to share these videos, every Nebula subscriber gets free week-long guest passes so that friends and family can watch literally anything they want. Anyways, Nebula, 40% off, early and exclusive videos, link below. I think that's everything. Is that everything? Yeah, okay, great. And as always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this entry, please lend your support by liking, subscribing, and hitting the notification icon to stay up to date on all things curious. See you in the next video.